Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Roundup. It's really rainy here today. It's been alternating between rain and crazy pouring rain, so if there's some weird background noise, I'm going to try my best to filter it out, but can't control the weather, so let's jump in and see what we got. First up, Stone Age Gamer is now selling a high-quality replacement power supply for the Sega Dreamcast made by Thundertronics called the Thunder Dream. So that makes sense. And this is an all-in-one PSU, so you don't need an internal replacement with an external brick. Everything is included directly on this unit, and it's designed with quality in mind. So all you need is just your standard flat two-prong AC cable, same exact as a normal Dreamcast cable would, but this will work with any Dreamcast, and it should also work with any power around the world. So this is essentially your universal power supply, but all built in internally. It's not cheap at $95. However, this seems to be a you get what you pay for scenario. And also, please remember that since you don't need an external brick, you save cost there. And decent external bricks are at least 20 bucks. So you just have to put all of that into perspective. Yes, it's expensive, but it is not overpriced. You're paying for what you're getting here, which is a high quality power supply. Also, Zaxor took a look at it. Zaxor is a power expert and gave it his thumbs up. So this seems like it would be a good replacement for people that need it. Now, one of the things that we've always talked about is when do you need a power supply replacement for an internal PSU? And the number one reason I could think of is if you have a region Dreamcast that doesn't match where your power region is. So you have a NTSC J1 that you're trying to use in PAL territory, then you could get a step up, step down converter to make those work. But that's a lot of extra equipment, and it's just so much easier to get a universal power supply. Also, if somehow your power supply is damaged beyond repair. But for the majority of people that just want a quality power supply, if theirs are dying or whatever else, you could just replace the capacitors on yours for some effort, but quite a lot less money. But people still do need replacements, so I'm very happy to see this one out there. There are cheaper ones that work fine. There are cheaper ones that are absolutely terrible, so you have to always kind of do your research and figure out which is which. But for me personally, if I needed to replace the power supply in my Dreamcast, I couldn't just fix the one that was in there, I would probably go to this one just for the mentality of spend a little bit more now and don't really worry about it. But the creator has a detailed video showing basically everything that you need to know. And I copied and pasted the features here if you just want a quick rundown of it. But basically, if you're looking for a not cheap, but high quality Dreamcast replacement PSU, check out the post in the video and see if this one's for you. Greg has just added more console options for his replacement rubber feet. And now consoles like the Dreamcast, PS1, SNES Junior, N64 and Game Boy Player even have rubber feet replacements available. The full list is in the post. I'm sure you just don't want to hear me list out a whole bunch of different consoles. But the prices range from $2.50 a kit to $6. And the more expensive ones are for things like the Xbox replacements that have the holes pre-cut, so you don't need to take the rubber feet off when you open up the top of your Xbox. The holes are already there. So this is just seems like kind of a no-brainer to me, especially if you're already going to order something from Laser Bear anyway. Why not just throw a couple of $2.50 kits in your cart, and it's not really going to affect shipping, so you might as well just get them, because I've seen so many rubber feet just deteriorate and fall off, and sometimes it doesn't really matter at all, but other times now your console might be a little wobbly, and in worst case, you could actually scratch the surface or scratch the console if it's worn out in a way where the plastic is now dragging across your table or whatever surface you have it on. So for this price, I would definitely recommend swapping it out when if yours are deteriorating and falling off. If they're fine, whatever. But I also think that if you've bought a really nice Retro Game Restore shell, or I guess any of the other clear replacement shells that don't come with feet, this is a really nice option because it raises it up. It allows more light to flow through. You don't have your brand new plastic rubbing up against the table or anything, which they seem to be pretty durable, but still. So I don't know. This is just one of those things where at first you might think like, who cares? I don't really need those. But if you think about it and you think about the cost, it seems like something that if you care about refurbishing your consoles and you've done everything else, you might as well make sure that the rubber supports on the bottom are good too. So check out the post and the links for everything that you need. But yeah, there's a ton of consoles supported now. So I would just grab a bunch of them if you needed it and save on shipping. Steve from RetroTech just did a video showing off a new style of CRT RGB mod that doesn't require a switch. So up until now, I'm going to oversimplify this so CRT enthusiasts don't get too mad at me, but basically, if you had a CRT that you want to inject RGB into that didn't have those inputs, you would use what they call the jungle chip, which is a chip that puts the on-screen display on many CRTs. And that on-screen display is displayed in raw RGBS so that you get the highest quality of the lettering on your screen. So you would lift the pins for that, and you would wire in a switch, and you would feed RGBS from a SCART connector or whatever else that way. And that way you could toggle between on-screen display on or on-screen display off, but RGB flowing through it. And it was a really good way in most cases to get RGB. I mean, you were really able to get the higher quality video, but then you don't have OSD support even, unless you turn the switch off. So this mod works by using a circuit board that's designed with diodes to only feed one or the other in. So you don't need to switch anything. If RGB is feeding through, it automatically will switch over to that. So this is something that's kind of cool. It's kind of the next evolution of RGB mod. And if you're into this stuff, it's definitely worth watching Steve's video. And he kind of shows it off and shows how he had to make the board and where the installation points were. For me personally, the mod that we're hopefully going to be doing soon to mine does have a switch because I want to be able to toggle between composite and RGB inputs. But if you want to see this thing in person, Steve is going to be bringing this to Retro World Expo in August, where we're all going to be hanging out there again. So if you want to see this thing in person and see what it looks like, it is a 36-inch giant, beautiful Sony Trinitron CRT that now looks more like a professional monitor because of this input mod. So watch the video if you're into it, but also definitely come by and say hi if you're going to Retro World Expo, because I think it's going to be pretty neat to see this thing in person. Dan Thrax from the Shiro crew recently did a whole write-up that highlighted all of the fixes SRG 320 has been doing to the Saturn core for the Mister. And there were some pictures that showed some of the backgrounds that weren't working correctly that are, and there was a couple more details as to which of the VDP issues that SRG 320 had been fixing and what that meant for the specific games that they helped. And basically, if you're a fan of the Saturn, if you're a fan of SRG 320s or just FPGA gaming in general, this is a worthy read because it kind of goes through and gives you sort of a sense of all of the work that goes into this. And the analogy was made is it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, where as soon as you find one problem, another one pops up. So this is just a great post that highlights how much work goes into this stuff in order to make playable cores. So just a polite reminder, if you have the ability to support these different devs and you're a fan of this work, consider signing up on Patreon. SRG 320 has one. There's the main Mr. one. Hotego has one. Of course, Shiro Crew has one as well. But, I understand if you're not in the position to, or if it's something that you're, just a casual user of. But if you rely on this stuff, if you love playing it and you just want to support people in the community, give that a consideration. And, definitely check out Dan's post, because this was a really great window into what changes are actually made when these updates happen. Next, I recently did a live stream checking out and reviewing a brand new Famicom console that was just released. And this one is similar to the previous ones that I tested that have a brand new motherboard and circuits around it, but use original Famicom CPU and PPUs, essentially making them run exactly like original consoles, except this one offers simultaneous 720p HDMI, RGB, S-video, and composite video outputs. It has NES controller ports in the front, a Famicom expansion port on the side, that Neo Geo controller looking port type of thing on the side, and it has zero latency, and it's basically compatible with absolutely everything original Famicoms would. There's a few things to note about this thing, but overall, I just thought it was a really cool way to play NES and Famicom games with all of those outputs supported. And it was compatible with basically every game that I played. It had some of the same incompatibilities that original Famicoms can often run into. And there were only a few issues to note. So first and foremost, you could use HDMI simultaneously with any one of those analog video outputs. And it has separate RCA outputs for video, composite video, and just standard RCA audio. But I didn't see any buffer circuitry, which means even though it has a Sega Saturn mini DIN port on it, you wouldn't be able to do something like use composite video from the RCA jack and a Sega Saturn composite video mini DIN cable, which that is probably not a likely scenario. However, if you use a sync on composite RGB cable, then you wouldn't be able to use the composite video output at the same time. I'm pretty sure. That's a guess, but I didn't see any circuitry that would let on that it would allow for that. However, if you wanted to use HDMI composite video in sync on either C-Sync or Luma RGB SCART at the same time, that would work. Same with HDMI composite video and S-video via the Sega Saturn mini DIN jack, that would also work. So technically you could have 3 simultaneous outputs from this thing. And if you're somebody that games on a CRT but wants to stream via a flat panel, obviously HDMI or the capture card to either direct your software to your software or flat panel, then this thing is awesome. The price is $300, which there were mixed feelings about that. I think people who understood what they were getting thought that was a fair price. And other people didn't, because I think they thought this was like just a cheap clone console Famicom on a chip type of thing. I think a lot of people assumed this was like a Hyperkin console, but it's not. It is officially using original CPU and PPUs on there. The only actual problem that I found was that they tested this the same way you would test an original AV Famicom. So when they tested the Zapper, they tested it through the Famicom expansion port, not the Player 2 port like you would see in an NES console. So in order to get Zapper working, you have to solder 2 wires just to connect the Player 2 port to the Famicom expansion port. In future releases, they're going to have this fixed both on the board, and I'm sure they could just add a patch cable for future purchases. So if you buy one right now, most likely this fix will already be implemented, or you could just use an NES to Famicom controller adapter for the Zapper. But point is, you couldn't really get any easier of a mod than this. Unbolt it, solder 2 wires to 2 very large pins, and you're done. And just match what I have here in the picture if you want to do that. So that proves that it's fully compatible, but it also proves that the output is 0 latency. Otherwise, it wouldn't accurately work with a light gun. And I posted a video showing that it definitely is. There's a few things I would like to see added to future firmware updates that I think are possible, and a few that are probably not possible. But it would be cool if the settings that you could get to in the menu saved every time you power it off. So right now, the aspect ratio defaults to full, and if you set it to a 4x3 square pixel, it'll go back to full when you power cycle. Same thing with the color palettes. So hopefully that could be added. And speaking of aspect ratios, I'd love to see a third mode added. At the moment, the one option, the default, is just fill the screen, and then you use your TV's aspect control to set that to 4x3. Or if you're Ian, you just play it wide. And then if you change the aspect, you get square pixels, which might be cool if you're using like a RetroTink or something like that, like the Tink 4K. You could use its decimation to knock that down and then get a full digital scale if you're NES. Except, what if you're using one of the many PC monitors that doesn't have aspect ratio control, or just a TV where the aspect control is a pain or introduces shimmering or something? So I would love to see a third mode added that's a 4x3 with interpolation. That way you don't get the shimmering on scrolling, and maybe you don't get it as sharp, but it's still a good option for people that don't have any kind of proper aspect control on their displays. Also, it seems like the expansion audio might have been calibrated with an EverDrive, which doesn't also always match original carts. But speaking of game of whack-a-mole, like I was just talking about, many different Famicom revisions play audio slightly different. So there is no true fix unless you decide, model revision X is the true Famicom and everything should sound like it. So it's something that most people would have to deal with, but it still would be neat to just have a couple of different audio options for mixing. So Famicom expansion audio might be too loud on one, not loud enough on another. Just having mode 1 or 2, no clue if that's possible. And I'd also like to see a purchase option that doesn't come with the CPU and PPU, because while it's not common, there are absolutely people out there with physically damaged or just fried motherboards from Famicoms or NESs, but the CPU and PPU are still good. So you could probably save some money and some time by just using that rather than refurbish the other one. So that would be kind of neat. I'd also like to see the ability to add more color palettes. The team said that they were looking into adding more color palettes as well, but I don't think we're ever going, because of how these things work, I don't think it's possible to have user added palettes. Like, you can't just dump them on a folder like you would on the Mister and select the one that you want, but that would be cool. And also, it would be nice if the micro SD card could work for anything other than firmware updates, like loading up palettes or something. But I totally understand if not, because this was designed to be as cheap as possible with a cheap FPGA to handle all of this stuff, which is why there really isn't an on-screen display. You just have to, there is the OSD, but you don't walk through it like you would in the Mister. You use button commands to change the different settings, and then that gets displayed on screen. So the settings are change the color palette between FCE Ultra, NTSC, PlayChoice 10, and YUV. Hopefully a few more will be added. You could toggle scan lines between 25, 50, and 75%, and those are basic, just horizontal scan lines. They're totally fine, but it's not CRT mask emulation. I wouldn't expect it to be. Switch aspect ratio, and then upgrade the firmware or view the firmware version before you upgrade, just to make sure you're not already on the latest. So overall, I really liked it. I thought it was neat. I thought it was a great option for people that want to use original Famicom carts or NES to Famicom with an adapter. And it's nice to see solutions like this that are, I mean, technically this is original hardware, and you might call the hybrid emulation the generation of the digital HDMI output, but it's still using the original PPU for all of this stuff. So I just think this is a really cool option. And I think a lot of people might be interested in it, but I also think a lot of people are like, I'll just spend that money and get a Mister. And that's totally fine too. I just think people sometimes get confused as to if your choice of a use case is original cartridges, something like this might be better. And if you don't care if you use original cartridges, you like to see them on your wall, but you just load ROMs however you want, maybe the Mister would be better. But we have options. I think it's very cool that this exists, and definitely check it out if you're interested. I have the full live stream or just the summary that I walked you through anyway if you just want to read it. A 3D level editor was just released for Super Mario 64 called Mario Builder 64, that, much in the style of Mario Maker, allows you to rebuild levels, and this is going to be fully playable on an N64 via an EverDrive or other ROM carts. Now, of course, you could design levels that are way too dense and have too much stuff going on that will either run very slowly or maybe would crash on original hardware. However, you could also just do the opposite and build one designed for it so it'll run exactly the same as original. So this is really, really cool for fans of Mario 64 who just want to build out their own levels and kind of put their own spin on the game, just like Mario Maker for the original Mario games. Now, one little bit of bad news, unfortunately, is it's not going to run on the Mister. While the ROM hack will load, it's impossible to save or load levels, as the core has no access to storage the way Pixel Launcher or the EverDrive does. Easy Goodnight reached out directly to Robert Pipe, the creator of the N64 Mister core, and he said it's never likely to support Mario Builder as it's currently implemented, because you'll have to focus on using that on original hardware. So that makes sense, because if you remember, Robert pushed that core as far as the DE10 could possibly handle it. So being able to go the full distance for something like this, it's just not possible with current DE10 hardware. But maybe the next evolution of the Mister would be able to have the last little bits of the N64 completed and something like this added. So if you want more info on it, absolutely check out Easy Goodnight's post, as well as the videos that were embedded in here. It seems like a really fun and awesome way to rebuild this, absolutely classic game. And we'll see what happens too. I'm sure it could also be implemented in some of the different reverse engineering projects. So maybe these 3D level editors would end up with fun PC style versions of it. Who knows? The choice is yours now. Check out the post for all the info, but this one seems neat. Next up, Yahel from Wrestling with Gaming just posted a video that chronicles the official ROM carts that Nintendo sold in Japan for the Super Famicom and the Game Boy. And this is pretty interesting, because you basically would walk into a Lawson store and you'd have to buy one of the flash carts, and then you would pay per ROM to program them to the cart, and it would run pretty similar to multi-carts of today, where you would just select your game from a list. It got a little weird, though, because it was limited to storage space. So even though there were 8 slots, some games took up multiple slots. So it could not be cost effective in some cases. And I don't want to spoil the video. I certainly try my best to motivate you all to watch them if this is something you're interested in. But what I will add is that the point Yahel made about how sometimes this would actually lose people money was kind of funny, because there were a couple of games that took up so much space that you really wouldn't be able to use this cart for anything else. And it would be cheaper to just buy that original game than it would be to buy this cart and then buy the software ROM version of it. But not only that, when you erased a game off of it, you could free up space, but then you would have to buy that game again, which seems so dumb. It would have been so easy just to have a receipt system that has the code of your ROM card on there, or maybe your customer code or whatever else, your phone number. It doesn't really matter. But there could have been so many easy ways to just track which games you bought. So if the game was $20 to buy, if you wanted to reprogram that in the future after you've erased it to make room for something else, maybe you charge a $2 reprogramming fee just to prevent kids from lining up every day to swap games around. That would have made perfect sense. It could have potentially made them more money. I have no idea why they didn't do that. So it's kind of funny that Nintendo's official ROM carts were kind of a flop. But I like the concept, and I think it really could have gone a lot farther if they cared to. But I don't know. Check out the video for yourself. It was another very interesting one. This one's kind of short. It was like 15 minutes, so it should be an easy watch for everybody. But maybe your eyes will roll as hard as mine did while watching them, just to see how this could have been such a cool idea, but didn't really end up that way. Tito from Macho Nacho Productions just posted a video about an OLED screen mod for the original Game Boy Color, and it looks absolutely awesome. The mod isn't too expensive at about $65, plus you're going to probably want the pre-cut case that's another $17 on top of that. However, it looks to be a very easy installation, and you only need to solder 1 or 2 wires. I think it was just 1 wire, so even a beginner could handle doing this. And it just looks really cool. The quality of the screen looks very high. The brightness seems fine. Not as bright as certain IPS kits, but if you're not in direct sunlight with scan lines on, it shouldn't make too much of a difference. But just the quality of it looked top notch. If you're a fan of any of this stuff, definitely watch this video. It's a typical awesome Macho Nacho video, but it's very cool to see the potential of OLED screens in handhelds. And the only thing I think could be cooler than this would be as if there was a Game Boy Advance version so that you could have the advantages of this on all of those classic Game Boy handhelds, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. But for now, I still think it's absolutely awesome. It also has a touchscreen built in, which seems very neat, but I don't think any of that stuff is necessary. I think using the button combos on your Game Boy is usually more than enough. But having a touchscreen reduces the amount of wires that you would have to solder because you don't have to tap into the buttons and the D-pad. So that also makes sense as well. And since the price isn't bad, it's not like you're spending $300 on this kit just to have a touchscreen in it. It's still that same price. And the touchscreen is how you would change some of the options and the brightness and stuff like that. So absolutely watch the video. But if you're a fan of this stuff, I would really seriously consider picking one up. There's also a limit to how many of these are available because I think they're leftover stock from a different device that was out there. But hopefully if people see the demand for this, they'll ramp up production again and just do another batch for us or something like that. So that wasn't, Tito made the point to say that wasn't meant to like drive a bunch of traffic to buy it right now. It was just being honest that like, hey, if a week goes by and these things are out of stock for good, I warned you, don't blame me for, I'm putting words in Tito's mouth here, but don't blame Tito for if this stuff goes out of stock and you can't get it anymore. It is what it is. And I'm still really glad he did the video showing it off. And I'd love to see one in person. I'm also kind of curious to see what the burn-in is like. Because I'm positive if you ran a burn-in test, like you left one game running, paused for days, you'd probably get permanent burn-in. But what about real-life usage? So playing a couple hours a day, would that actually do anything? And if it would, how long would it take? So only time will tell for that one, but it still looked really awesome. So check it out if you're interested. Now it's time for this week's Mr. Updates, care of Lou from Lou's Retro Source. As usual, I'm just going to skim through these, and there's a lot of info on alternative hardware that's still compatible with Mr. So this is getting exciting in the Mr. hardware side of things as well. First up, Takayurin posted mock-ups of the I/O ports for the upcoming consoleized Mr. consoles that they're working on. So this is assumed to be like a dedicated Genesis, a dedicated SNES, both of which would have working controller ports. And the ports on the back are basically break everything out. HDMI, component video, composite video. It's awesome. It's perfect. It really seems absolutely great for what you would want for something like this. I'm going to buy an FPGA console that's dedicated, that plays original carts. So, why not try to get everything you can out of that? I really hope that there's potential for them to work in things like maybe, some of the newer cases that look like originals, or if they're going to be made up in cases that look like originals, because that is kind of an important factor, right? If you're really pushing to use original cartridges, very often you're going to want something that kind of looks and feels like the original console you'd have plugged it into, but we'll see how that kind of pans out. But there's a bunch of different versions. There's also a handheld, which Taki Uden mentioned looking into OLED screens for, and it's going to be supposedly about $150. So imagine running Mister on that. That would be pretty incredible. And there's also just going to be a flagship version that's not quite ready to be shown. So a lot of cool stuff developing there. And there's also the same DE10 alternative being developed. And I think they're probably based on the same software or on the same hardware. So you wouldn't have to change the hardware. Next up, Shane Lynch is making progress reverse engineering that Sega Megaplay hardware, and he created a custom BIOS to analyze the hardware and was able to get audio working for console games and Splatterhouse 2. So that's pretty awesome. Creating a custom BIOS for basically the Genesis is nuts. Next up, Todd from RetroFrog showed details of the Mars FPGA case, and it has removable slots for different cartridge inputs as well as different controller inputs. So it was really shown, the expansion capabilities of this thing were shown off, and it looks really good. So hopefully we could see this thing more in action soon and kind of get more details on when it might be available. Next, Track 17 posted an update regarding the coin-op collection. There was some refactoring done to Toaplan version 2 games, and a different version of Whoopee was added to the Teiki-Paki core. The next game being planned is Gox, a game that plays kind of like Arkanoid, but with a different twist. Also, just to clarify, the Mister will be supported when possible for these releases. So I think some stuff that he had said was taken out of context. Basically, I'm pretty sure I'm getting this right. If a game is reverse engineered and will work on the Mister, the coin-op collection team will port it to the DE10. But if the DE10 is not powerful enough, the source code will be available. Somebody could try their own shot at this thing, but that's why some of these games might not end up on the Mister and DE10, because they actually wouldn't be able to run on that hardware. They would need more powerful hardware. So I'm pretty sure I got that right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a misunderstanding that the coin-op collection wasn't supporting Mister anymore. That's just not the case. It's just the hardware isn't always going to be fast enough to run it. Next up, a new sound implementation was now being used on the AO486 core for the OPL3, which is an FM sound chip that you could find on Sound Blasters and some of the other cards. So that's awesome. That's a newer implementation and more accurate sound. Next, Hotego released the first beta for the Sega System 18 core, and the supported games are Shadow Dancer and Blockseed. Shadow Dancer looks to me like Shinobi, but with just newer hardware. It looked very cool. And this is for Patreon supporters only, because Hotego does that thing that I still always have thought is a great idea, that your beta testers or your supporters get to be beta testers, and then it's released to the public when it's stable enough. But that way you just don't have the public thinking there's broken cores, so it kind of works for everybody. Next, the Mini Mig Amiga core has been ported to the Mystex project. So Hans has been making more progress with that, and that's another way to try to run mostly the same Mister software on a different set of hardware. Very important. And it looks like another DE10 Nano clone is being developed by QM Tech. However, the pictures that they showed kind of alluded to the fact that they might not work with existing cases, even though they're very close to the same layout. Certain things were moved around that you would have to get all new cases and probably a new I/O board for it as well if you use the I/O functionality. So it's good and bad, but the target price is $99. So this does make a lot of sense, just like the other ones that were being worked on. And it's weird that we're seeing a lot of these DE10 alternatives pop up now all at the same time, but whatever. Next, FPGA Arcade has posted the latest info for their upcoming Replay 2 board, which is a mini ITX board based on the Intel Agile X5 FPGA. So porting cores from the Mister should be very easy. And there's 2 versions planned, a standard version that's roughly 4 times the size of the DE10 Nano, and then a light version that's somewhat larger than the Cyclone 5 on the DE10. And I believe the standard version could do 4K 60 as well. So yet another alternative to the hardware to the Mister. Once again, though, this is still all surrounding and supporting the original Mr. reverse engineered cores and stuff like that. So while some of these might require forked software, it's still relying on the same amazing, essentially donations from the community of their time reverse engineering this stuff. So it's all very awesome. And lastly, there's a new Tap 2 release, and there's a huge overhaul to amiibo handling and UI. You could now match on criteria like game series and characters. And now it also identifies game launches and commands like credit inserts separately. And MGL files can be placed directly on a tag as well. So I still love the Tap 2 project. I think it's very cool. The novelty has not worn off. It still just seems like a really fun and sometimes just much easier way to launch ROMs. So definitely check that out if you're interested. So that's it for this week. Thanks so much to Lou for keeping up with this stuff. There's no chance I would be able to do all this without him. So please consider supporting Lou up on Patreon, and at the very least, support by subscribing on YouTube, because that's completely free. Well, that's it for this week. I had to record these a little bit earlier, so it's possible that some posts came in after I was done recording, but before this podcast was launched. And if that's the case, I'll just get to them next week and I'll make sure nothing's lost. But I always want to clarify that in case you think I missed something, or generally speaking, though, when this happens, it's not time sensitive. It's not like I forgot to talk about a pre-order that's already opened and closed by the next week. It's usually just cool stuff that we hadn't had time to get in before the wire. So as always, thank you to everybody who watches, listens, plays nicely in the comments, and especially thank you to anybody who supports in absolutely any way, because it really is you who's keeping all this stuff alive. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week. This week's Roundup is brought to you by Neo Paradigm Entertainment, connecting Southeast Asian influencers with opportunities in the West.